Welcome to the London Business School and to the fifth session in our series, Gaining Ecosystem Advantage. Today, we're going to be focusing on sport, leading a sports ecosystem in a crisis. How far does authority stretch? We're going to focus on rugby, although there will be parallels with many other sports. So I hope this piques your professional interest in ecosystems and all the topics around it, strategy, leadership, negotiations, managing in a crisis, as well as perhaps your personal interest in sport as a participant or a viewer. My name is David Lansfield. I'm a catalyst strategist and coach. I work with senior executives, professionals, and entrepreneurs, helping them become even more extraordinary. I worked on ecosystems back to 1998, before the term was even used, working across 20 countries and 15 different ecosystems. I'm a contributor to Harvard Business Review and a former senior partner in strategy. And my co-host, Professor Michael Yacobides, is otherwise engaged on something very important in a maternity hospital. And we wish him and his wife very well. He'll be back for the next one. And as you know, we're inviting some wonderful guests from the world of business, consultancy, and academia to share their experiences, lessons, and research and tips on how you, however you're involved in ecosystems, can succeed in that difficult and challenging world. To that end, I'm very happy, very, very happy to see somebody I've known for a while now, Darren Childs, the former CEO of Premiership Rugby and of UK TV and various other roles in the media world. Including, for example, BBC Studios, as it's now called. Darren is also a board member at Viz RT Group and Antenna Group, an advisor to CVC Partners. So the idea today is to share some fresh insights, some tips. We want this to be more than a two-way conversation, as fun and enjoyable as it will be. So please do share your comments and questions in the box, the chat box. We'll pick those up as we go. And be courageous today. Bring them forward early. What we tend to find is that within 5 or 10 minutes to go, we get a whole flurry, and I don't want to frustrate anybody by not answering them. So come forward with comments, questions, whatever you like. There are no silly questions. Yeah. So Darren, welcome. Fantastic to have you here today.
Thank you, David. And say hi to everyone that's joined the call. Hope you find this interesting and there's some good takeaways from it.
Indeed, there will be. Don't worry. So let's talk about rugby. It's a sport people may or may not know or play, but just paint the picture for us in terms of the ecosystem of rugby, in terms of the product, if you like, or the service, before we delve into your role in it and the challenges, particularly during the pandemic and beyond.
Sure. Look, I think it's fair to say that in comparison to other businesses that I've run, sport has the most complex and often kind of opaque ecosystem I've ever come across. Actually, I say that because great business success comes when you have alignment of values and purpose with stakeholders. And as the chief exec, part of your kind of unwritten job description, if you want to be successful as an organization, is to lead that ecosystem. So in preparation for today's discussion, I was actually mapping out the ecosystem within rugby. And actually, when I put it down on paper, fair to say, it even surprised me, even though I've been in the thick of it for a number of years. So I put it into kind of 3 buckets, really, in order for it to kind of make sense for everyone, because it is quite complicated. And I'll run through this reasonably quickly. So, bucket A is what I would call the kind of government and regulatory part of the ecosystem. And that was a huge part of sort of my life as chief exec and an impact on the business. Not just because of the pandemic, even though that did, of course, amplify their involvement, but there is just a huge amount of political interest in sport. You saw it recently with football. It's just interesting to politicians because it's very well connected to customers and has a strong voice. So we were involved with number 10 during the pandemic, went all the way to number 10. We were involved with DCMS, which is the Departure of Culture, Media and Sports, which has had the added complexity for those of you that saw the reshuffle last week, that I think even in the last 5 or 6 years, they're on this 6th minister of media.
That's something that other countries face as well, right? That's not just a UK thing. We see it in many other countries changing.
Yeah, that's right. But it just creates a huge amount of complexity because you start to build relationships with senior people and you start to get into a cadence of how you can move things forward, and then they change and then you've got to start again and again. it's something you just got to be very, very conscious of. As well, in government, we were very involved with Treasury. As you know, it was public that we secured an £88 million rescue package for the clubs that were in quite severe financial crisis due to the fact that their revenue had been stopped overnight. And you won't be surprised to know that actually when there's a big government decision, Treasury is involved. Even if it's not financial, Treasury has a lot to say about quite a lot of things. And so you've got to deal with all those guys. We also had the complexity of dealing with PHE, Public Health England, critical advisors to the government on during the pandemic. And actually, we were in daily contact with them about how we could actually get the game restarted and how we could do it safely and the rules and regulations around that. And then even down to kind of local councils and councillors, clubs are active in their community. They do a lot of charity work. It's no coincidence that the clubs a lot of the clubs opened their doors to become vaccine centres. They're very close to their communities. And so in the sort of government and regulatory bucket, you've got all of that complexity to deal with just in the first bucket. That's before you even get into the specifics of the sport. So, when you look at how kind of rugby's governed, and this hasn't changed in a long, long time, at the top of that ecosystem, you've got World Rugby, which is the sports governing body. That's predominantly made up of union representatives from around the world, which sit and basically come up with all the rules and tournament regulations for that. You've got the within the UK, which was relevant for us being a UK business. You've then got the RFU executive, the Rugby Football Union executive, and the RFU Council, the legendary 50 grumpy old men. I sat on the council for a number of years, and they're not grumpy.
Not a lot of diversity there, Darren.
They're not grumpy, but they are mostly men.
Yes.
And again, there's a lot of work to do, I think, there in terms of bringing that up to date. And I know it's a big focus for the RFU to actually do that. Then you've got the Professional Game Board, which governs professional sport, and that's a kind of a joint working group between the RFU, the Championship, and the Premiership. And then you've got the RPA, which is the Players Association, which is actually looking after player welfare as well. So that's just the rugby governance piece.
Yes,
and that's before you even got into running your own business. Within the PRL ecosystem, you've got your boards. Your normal finance audit Remco, you've got your club boards, you've got your exec team. And again, you've got all that to deal with before you even have a moment to start thinking about dealing with your product and your business. And once you start adding that level of complexity to it, I kind of roughly totted up that we were dealing with 30 broadcasters globally. We had a £150 million TV deal to renew whilst the game was suspended, which was not easy. You've got 20 plus sponsors and commercial partners. You've got 13 clubs with their commercial relationships. You've got press. Someone said to me before I took on the job, you do realise there's more journalists covering rugby than there are covering Brexit. And that was very much the case. It's a big ecosystem in its own right. And that's all before you've put a single game on. So before this show even starts, you've got to deal with that. And then to actually make the games happen, you've got to deal with the clubs, you've got medical advisory boards, you've got salary cap groups, you've got refs, organizations to deal with, you've got sporting committees which deal with all the regulations, you've got disciplinary committees you've got to chair which deal with infringements on the field and off the field. And as well as throughout all that, we had a pretty significant independent review going on, led by Lord Miners into the salary cap breach, which was all running on that. So if that's not enough, we also owned a third of the European Heineken Cup tournament. So you can double all that, because it all literally happened in an identical way across in Europe.
Darren, I'm exhausted already. It's as Sam reminded me, it's World Fitness Day, and I shouldn't be exhausted. I should be fit, but I'm exhausted already. I mean, that's fascinating. I'm sure we'll go into more detail in a moment. Yeah. It's fascinating. I'm glad you did that exercise. We haven't done that in previous sessions. We've talked about issues within ecosystems, but even actually sort of scribbling out, sketching, mapping out the ecosystems you are in, that you orchestrate, you participate in. As I was saying before we got on today, it's an exercise I do with some of the executives I work with who say, oh, by the way, ecosystems are not that important, or although you describe them in one field. You start mapping out in the way you've just done in the last few minutes, most times people say, oh, I didn't quite realize that these entities were important to us, or actually it was that complex and so on. So as a takeaway, actually going into your own organization, whether you're in business or as a consultant, actually mapping out where you play, what type of relationships you are and how much influence you have, I think is a great starting point. So in all of that...
Go on, sorry.
No, go on, Darren. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, and you've got to manage that ecosystem as well, and actually understanding its complexity, I think, is going to be key to your success and most likely to your sanity, particularly when you're going through a crisis. Now, look, I would say the ecosystem I've just described is not one that you would take into any kind of crisis environment. It was too large, too many stakeholders, too many committees. And when you're going through a crisis, you need to be decisive and you need to be quick and responsive in your leadership. Yes. And you need to have a very efficient ecosystem, almost like a startup, because you're almost starting from scratch. Everything you kind of knew about your business gets thrown out, and you've got to pretty much start again. So look, for me, in summary, the key dependencies in that business were frighteningly close to 50 boards and groups, committees and key clients that I had to deal with, plus probably another 50 or so that can be delegated. So hugely complicated. And I think the takeaway here is certainly not to replicate this system in your own business. But some of you may be dealing with this if you're in kind of very large and complex ecosystems or public service or whatever. And look, my advice would be to, as you just said, David, map your ecosystem before you start. Reduce it if you can, eliminate parts of it if you can, delegate parts of it if you can. But you need to focus. Certainly for me, my focus was on the fans and the players, and all of these things were a huge distraction to that. But each part of that ecosystem needs to be man-marked and it needs to be resourced. And you need a strategy for complex ecosystems like this. You have a business strategy, you've got a people strategy, you spend loads of time as an exec team building all that kind of stuff. But I think you actually, my learning from this complex role was actually we should have done more work in terms of mapping that strategy out and doing more to it. I think William Blake said that, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. And I think when it comes to ecosystems, you've got to give yourself permission to kind of reassess them, but make sure you've got them man-marked and covered. Yeah. Otherwise your life becomes pretty unpleasant pretty quickly.
There's a lot of wisdom in there, a lot of scars, and we may come on to that. And I wasn't expecting William Blake today, but there you go. What can you ask for? Let's get some questions and comments. There's a lot of content in there. There's a lot of richness in there. So come forward with your comments in the chat box if you would. So Darren, given that you've touched on it, let's talk about your role as CEO. Given that picture that you just articulated so eloquently, how would you describe your key focus, your key activities as the CEO of the Premiership within the ecosystems you just described?
Well, I think the main role of leadership in any organization is pretty similar, actually, certainly across all the ones that I've led. I think what added a little more to the chaos at the Premiership than normal was that we had two massive issues very early on. So, week 2 was the salary cap judgment against Saracens, and week 20, I was receiving phone calls from government telling us that they were going to be shutting our business down and that we weren't going to be able to play anymore. And all that came on the back of an intensive negotiation to bring in funding from private equity. So, there wasn't a lot of time in there to catch your breath. So, yes. The results of our first crisis were pretty public. It was written about a lot in the papers, so I won't go through that again, although there are some good leadership lessons in there for another day. But the second part, the pandemic, was probably less public. And when you have to stop trading because of a pandemic, it makes lots of people, in fact, it makes everybody in your ecosystem terrified of losing their livelihoods, losing their careers. Yes. Losing their investments. And as the chief exec, you've got to hold all that together. You've got to fix all those big problems, and you've got to reassure everybody in the ecosystem that it's actually going to be okay. And if I'm to be critical of myself, I think, we did an excellent job of keeping the business going. And as you know, it started its next season with all the clubs intact and solvent and still trading. But, I think one of the balls that I dropped was not doing enough with the fans and not engaging actually directly with the fans. But I would say that, if you want to survive in that chaos and come through the other side, you've really got to be clear about what your own values are, because they're going to get tested, and they're going to get tested 20 times a day. So we all know a crisis brings out the best in people, but it also brings out the worst in some people. And you've got to be very conscious of your own value framework for dealing with the big issues. A good example is we came under huge criticism from the pro-Saracens press about the decision to relegate them from the league due to the salary cap issues. Yeah. And you've got to take that. So look, you and I have talked about this before, David. My strongest view on this is, as chief exec, your number one priority is to get the culture right in order for the business to deliver.
Yes.
For the shareholders. What I mean by culture is values, what it feels to work there. Why do clients want to work with us? Why do customers want to use our services? And how do we get the right people on the bus by creating an environment where people want to do their best work? So,
and Darren, when you say culture there, I mean, that's the culture of the Premiership organisation, but I guess you want to instill that in the ecosystem partners, organisations that you work with as much as possible, where you have candidly less direct authority, although you have influence on, as I say, their livelihoods or other aspects. Where in that picture were the biggest tensions, if you like, between the entities and the ecosystems you alluded to?
There were lots, and I'll give you a couple of specific examples. But I think the thing around leadership is kind of self-awareness that a lot of things are out of your control. You may think they're all under your control, but a lot of things are out of your control. Financial markets are out of your control, customers are out of your control, earthquakes out of your control, global competition, it's out of your control. Most everything is ultimately out of your control. But when you have a tangible point of focus, i.e. your organization's culture and values, you can actually keep the team moving forward despite confusion, despite uncertainty,
yes,
and in spite of even chaos. And the reason why I say that is because actually one of the things that got us through the crisis was certainly got me through it, was Churchill's quote, which was, "If you find yourself in hell, keep going." And that having that focus on your organization's culture and in order to give you a clear decision-making framework when you're going through a real crisis is the thing that will keep you sane and allow you to keep the team going and keep momentum going, so that you can work through those issues and come out the other side.
And going back to I hear that. That's the second brilliant quote of the day. I expect some more, by the way, as we go through this. You touched on this earlier, and Sam asked a great question around, simplification of the ecosystem. Once you mapped it, could you, even in the crisis, have tried to simplify? Could you have delegated more, simplified, or participated if you had not to criticize you, but if you had your time again, could you have done that? Or was it more about working within the existing stakeholders and partners in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile going through the exercise of working out what is absolutely critical to you and to the success of the business, not what is the nice to haves.
Yeah.
So the honest answer to that question is, there were a number of things I could have cut out and delegated. We were unfortunately in that process of kind of rebuilding a team whilst also hitting the crisis. So it was a kind of triple whammy. But look, I think again, my advice is to map it and simplify it and delegate it. And because certainly when you're going through a difficult period, it's really easy to underestimate how much time you need to spend on these things. I was spending probably 70% of my time in bucket one, which is the government side of things. Getting the game restarted was critical to the financial security of everybody. Getting the government aid in place to make sure the clubs remain solvent. There are certain things you can't delegate, but there are probably some things in there that I could have done in retrospect. But
that's really hard, though. If you're going through, you're already in a complex ecosystem, and you're facing a crisis, the pandemic, and you've got the salary cap issue, and you're building your team. So in a way, you're building up the capability of people. That's pretty hard.
Yep.
Wow. Aaron's asked a good question, which is, in terms of those interactions with stakeholders, you don't have direct authority. You can't pay them a bonus or directly affect their incentives. What are your tips of effectively when you've had your best interactions with people, in terms of your engagement day to day? What have you done well to engage them?
Yeah, look, it's very difficult to lead without authority. In fact, it's really tough. It's really tough to do it. I'm sort of bordering on saying it's impossible to do it, but you can get,
because people talk about make sure the purpose is really clear and they'll come with you, all that sort of stuff. You read in articles. I mean, it's not enough, is it?
No, it's not. It's not enough. So you end up spending a ton of time trying to persuade people, cajoling people across the line, and it's very difficult when you're in a crisis. If you're commanding an army and you were trying to take a hilltop, you wouldn't have an ecosystem like the one that we had. You need clear lines of authority, quick decision making, and everything else. But I think for me, the thing that kept it going was that you just need to be able to lead with integrity. You've got to lead without favor, and you've got to be really well prepared. You've got to have really well researched your arguments, and then you need to start the negotiation. And people talk about negotiating deals with clients or suppliers. In these complex ecosystems, you're negotiating all the time within your own ecosystem. So but I found that once the fireworks were over, and the majority had seen the logic of what we were trying to do, the others would eventually fall in line. But there's conflict of interest in there. And I think the takeaway from that one is you've got to make sure you've got the bandwidth in order to deal with these things, because they take significantly longer than you'd expect.
So I guess you have to prioritize the moments that particularly matter, the complex interactions you have to really focus on, and if you can, delegate and share with others more. And preparation, to just give some practical, when you're going into a big negotiation or discussion with either a government stakeholder or a commercial partner, what sort of things would you do to prepare? You'd have
to do a ton of work actually across a number of different areas. You'd have to do certainly from a pandemic perspective, there were a whole bunch of health issues, which, I'm a businessman. I'm not a medical professional, whatever. A lot of that was new to us, and a lot of us in the league, and we had to get up to speed pretty quickly. But you really had to understand a lot of those issues. You've got to have done your legal due diligence on where you are legally. You've got to have done your governance due diligence in terms of, some things are within your control, some things are within the governing body's control, or whatever. So just the amount of preparation was huge, was absolutely huge. And I kind of used to have a kind of rule of thumb that you could determine the length of any conference call by how many people were on it. So, and I worked out over 30 years that every person on it would take 10 minutes. So if it was one-to-one, you could get it done in 20 minutes. If there was 6 people, take you an hour. When I was at the BBC, you'd get 40 people turn up for one of these conference calls, and you just check in for the entire afternoon, knowing that it was going to go on forever. And I think one of the things I learned with this one was, when you've got these complex ecosystems like sport, it takes months and months and months to get anything done, and you've just got to make sure you've got the runway and the bandwidth in order to do it.
How do you so let's think about those. What were the in the tenure that you had, starting with the real crisis situation and working through, and obviously you had some commercial negotiations in terms of the TV contracts. What were the most difficult strategic decisions you faced for the organizations in terms of strategy? What were the big moves and decisions you had to take in terms of the direction of the sport and obviously the commercial aspects too? What would you call out in the journey?
Yeah, look, that's probably a 10-hour discussion to go through it all and give it a fair response. But top of mind, just to pick out a few. And again, in the context of something that can be taken away, I think, look, anyone that's starting in a new senior role, I think, some of the hardest decisions are going to be in your first 6 months, because even in a normal period, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to assess if you have the team required to execute the mission. And, as a new chief exec or anyone taking on a big team, you have a real moment of clarity in those early months that you have to make sure that you use, because you can see everything very clearly before you get bogged down and everything else. So you've got to really kind of deal with that one. And again, I think that's one of the big challenges. I think specific to PRL, I think one of the big tough decisions we had to make in kind of June 2020 was to cut everyone's salary across the entire ecosystem. Players, coaches, club owners, club CEOs, myself, all the staff. And again, it was going back to values. It was about we very clearly set out that we wanted to make sure that all of the clubs came through this, and we could.
Yes.
They all survived and they all carried on trading, after the pandemic, because they have an important role, not just to play in the sport, but in the communities, that they serve. So that was really tough. But I'm pleased that we managed to protect the future. We didn't lose a club. They're all still trading and still solvent, even though. Again, it was one of those things that you take a bit of a beating from the press and everyone else that's kind of been involved in it. But it was done with the right intentions and has had the right outcome and result for everybody.
I guess it's trying to keep a clear head in the negotiations and those difficult decisions is critical. And when the keeping your sanity, as you referred to earlier, Leonardo says absolutely. In negotiations, it's not about positions. It's about interests, options, alternatives. Your best next alternative option, and I guess keeping commitments along the way in terms of treating people with respect is very easy. I've been involved in a lot of negotiations where people may win in the short term, but they forget there's a longer term. I use the pun intentionally. There's a longer term game. Yeah, so they may win, but actually damage the relationship, or get really stuck in something and get the short term payoff. And then when they need to do the next deal, renew something, innovate, and do some innovation in the sport or whatever it is, people don't really want to talk to you. So I guess
there's a real partnership issue within sport. I still think it's very siloed. Right. You're touching on kind of quite a kind of raw nerve within the kind of rugby ecosystem, that it's not working together in the way that it should do in order to, and again, as I said, my two guiding principles was what's in the best interest of the fans and what's in the best interest of the players, and once that's worked out, everything else fits into place. Yes. If you've got healthy players with long-term careers, you can have better competitions. If you've got fans enjoying the experience, then the commercial side of the business is going to start to take care of itself. Nice, simplifying some of those tactical things down to some kind of major objectives. But rugby's not been professional for very long. It's been an amateur sport for a long time. It hasn't been a professional business for long, and it's got some way to go, but it's on a journey.
So we talked about crisis, but let's talk about some more positive moments, although there was lots of learnings and very positive legacies you left, Darren. Think about innovation in ecosystems. You talked about, obviously, in the fans' interest and the players' interest and that virtuous circle you were just describing. As the CEO, how do you actually drive innovation? Thinking about, okay, how do we make it even better for fans? How do we make sure that there's innovation when you have so much complexity around you? I mean, if you're running your own business without any ecosystem, which is quite rare these days, you could probably be quite directional and say, right, let's get a team, a huddle together, let's do a sprint, let's innovate. Third parties. How do you do that in a more complex environment and a high profile environment? How do you innovate?
It's a good question, actually. Look, I think you need to constantly challenge everything that you're doing, and I think that's an attitude. I think it's not a process. It starts with an attitude. It becomes a process, and rugby, candidly, is not good with change. It's very traditional, and for all very good reasons. It's very traditional. It's very slow to change and whatever. But a good example actually was during the pandemic. I don't know, for many of you that watched it. one of the regulations around restarting the game is that we had to take orchestrated water breaks so that every player had their own water bottle, so there wasn't cross-infection. So normally people would share them or whatever, and so we had to have these kind of organized water breaks, and the result of that was it gave players 5 minutes to recoup, and in my opinion, actually made the game more exciting and intense, because they were a little bit refreshed for that kind of second quarter of the game. Interestingly, commercially, it would have also allowed us to insert an additional commercial break, because there was a 5-minute break.
There's the TV man in you coming out.
I was pushing quite hard to say, well, why don't we just keep this as a permanent innovation? We've tried something. It's not taken anything away from the product. In fact, it's actually enhancing the product and making it better. But it was that kind of change is difficult to get people to think about. So look, I think again, it's part of the traditions of sport and rugby. It's going to be reasonably slow moving. But outside of PRL, I think innovation again is linked to culture. If you've created the right environment within the organization where your people are encouraged and rewarded for challenging and innovating, and it's a bit overused, but you celebrate the misses as well as successes, you can harness the whole company to innovate. And I think with everything moving so quickly now, the pace of business is so different to how it was 20 or 30 years ago. I think everyone in your organization needs to be innovating. Not innovating the IT systems or whatever, but innovating the way that they work and
keeping a focus, as you're saying, Darren, if I interject, around how does it deliver for the main actors, the actors in the system, which are the fans and the fans and the players and everyone, sort of actually lining up against them rather than just, if you like, doing it in your own space.
Look, I think it's part of your job is to make sure your whole company is innovating, and success is when you step back and you're kind of inundated with people wanting to innovate and change and do find better ways of doing things. At UKTV, we had a separate innovation pot, a funding pot of, quite a lot of money, multiple millions of pounds a year, which we would deploy to great ideas. And the only caveat was that for it to be true innovation, it couldn't have a business plan. Because if you can do a business plan, then that's not innovation, that's iteration. And so, we had a small group of people, and the reason why it was so successful is as money got allocated into these innovation ideas, I would allocate one of my direct reports to actually shadow whoever that was through the entire process. And then, we would make a massive song and dance, celebrate it.
Yeah, that's great. Great sponsorship, great recognition. Because you often see in these, crowdsourcing activities, more open innovation, you see a lot of great work with the generation of ideas, but then the selection and then the scaling up, often sometimes people lose interest, or it just becomes one of those things you do in a summer's day, like an interesting hackathon. Leonardo makes a great point. Of course, you've got to spend the time in preparation and throughout, whether you're innovating or just doing deals, of understanding and really anticipating their needs and talking to them. The power of conversation in business is critical, but especially when you're dealing with so many different entities, your ability to flex your style, genuinely listen. Hold your tongue when you hear something, and I imagine there's a few characters in rugby who are not shy of coming forward when they're unhappy. But just one other point, if we go slightly laterally for a moment, we talked a lot about the rugby ecosystem and the three buckets within it, and then the multiple organisations. Who did you feel you were competing against from a competitive perspective, strategically? For example, the fans, did you have that in your mind, or were you mostly focusing on?
It's actually a really good question, and I think the only way you can look at this is we very much believe that we weren't just in sport, we were in what they call the attention economy, which is value is created in our business from people attending stadiums and people's eyeballs being on our TV output.
Yes,
that's in essence kind of sport, and it's the same for most businesses actually. So on the first one, you're competing with people's life cadence, and it's hard if you're a family man to be away at games every weekend. So you start looking at midweek games. Monday Night Football has been a huge success, and that's what it's about. It's about, you can't go every Saturday to a game and stay married. So it certainly puts a challenge on it. So, you've got to think about innovative ways about how you can build a schedule to make it easier for people to go. And on the second one, there's lots of sport on TV. So you need to build a narrative. You need to keep people hooked. Promotion and relegation is a big part of that. Transfers, local derbies, those kind of things that keep the story alive throughout the entire season. You have to make sure the game is fast and it's kind of, moving forward. There's, quite a lot of time wasted in the last 10 minutes of a rugby game. So you got to be prepared to deal with the regulators and the players are on that one. But you just need to keep it. It needs to be exciting and relevant. For it, but you're not just competing with other sports, you're competing with every single thing that can take someone's attention away. And I think you've got to be very conscious, and therefore you've got to be really close to the fans and the customers in order to understand that for you to be successful.
And that has to be a mindset rather than just a sort of periodic exercise. It has to be, you've got to spend time with them, do it, watch it. Yeah. I'm always struck with how few sometimes executives at the top of their organization don't actually consume or watch their product or serve it or use their product that much. Now, they would always have an excuse of saying, well, I'm really busy with X, Y, and Z. So you sort of do need to understand your product or service and actually understand the people on the front line. The people, I guess the stewards, the people right on the pitch, understanding their experience, some of the challenges, and sort of start there. I call it working the edges of the organization as opposed to, if you like, just in the boardroom.
The best person to talk to in a club is the groundsman.
Yeah. What do they tell you?
They know everything. They know everything. They'll tell you the things that no one else has got the courage to tell.
Yeah, I guess they see everything about what was really happening in the club.
Exactly right, and you got to go and talk to them and engage with them. And the dullest place to be at a sports event is in the executive box.
You go. You heard it here first. Yeah. We've got about 5 minutes to go. I'm sure there's some more questions and comments people want to raise. I'm keen, as you look on to the next chapter in your career and your life, Darren, what are you most proud of, and what would you change in your next executive or non-executive role in your own skill set? So what are you most proud of, and what would you change?
I think the biggest achievement was that, and I've mentioned it already, so I won't labor on it, was the fact that we kept everybody solvent. Rugby has lost clubs in the good years.
Yes.
They've hit the financial wall and they've gone out of business, and there's a number of big brands that no longer exist in the good years. So I'm really proud that we managed to pull the 13 clubs together, pull government together, pull PHE, to get the protocols so that we could actually start playing the game, so that we could survive. And it's fantastic now that the season started last Friday. The next season started next Friday with full stadiums, and hopefully, touch wood, business can start to rebuild. So I think that's our proudest achievement, that we didn't end up being an 8-club league. And also we kept everybody safe. We kept the staff safe. We kept the players safe.
Yes.
It cost us a huge amount of money to put the testing regimes, helicopters flying from clubs to Ireland for overnight testing so games could happen. Huge amount of money we had to invest in that kind of stuff. But we kept everybody safe, and we've kept, people's livelihoods going. And I think
that's very impressive. Before you go on to what you changed, Puneet asked a great question of, what lessons did you learn or have you learned from other sports in your journey? I know that Gareth Southgate, the England football manager, has gone out and reached out to other executives. I think he spoke to some people in Formula One about their experience, or I guess elite performance. What did you learn from other sports?
Yeah, not as much as I would have hoped, because we were dealing with a pandemic. Actually.
Yeah,
so
you have a huge amount of time, right?
Actually, what was quite interesting was behind the scenes. I don't think it's ever been written about or talked about, but all the sports CEOs decided we were going to help each other. So we set up a WhatsApp group, and we had weekly calls with each other. We had, when we were openly sharing information, which under normal circumstances you wouldn't share for competitive reasons, but we were sharing with everybody. They were sharing with us. We were all learning really quickly, and all the CEOs just in a very natural way just kind of decided we were going to help each other through it, and we did. And across sports, all the different sports, we were all talking, communicating with each other, and that was a very powerful group, informal group that I think has got a lot to a lot of credit for getting sport in the UK back happening again.
That's fantastic, and that's great. I mean, you'd hope that some of that spirit would continue, at least some of the foundations, at least.
Yes,
we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
So, what would you, looking forward? And I know you're a person that takes your own development very seriously, and you have non-exec roles, you have an advisory role now. What's the one thing you would now do more of? Let's be positive. Do more of in those future roles based on your experience that you just talked through, in terms of a mindset, a skill, a practice.
Yeah, look, I think we've covered some of it. I think I would have felt more comfortable abdicating more responsibility going into a crisis. But again, look, our time wasn't normal. It was, quite unique. And so I think that would have made life a little bit easier. For me, I think that's probably the main one, of just kind of being comfortable letting go. It's difficult when you're getting into a business that, I'd never run a sports business. So for me, I wanted to get involved in lots of different areas because I wanted to learn. And,
pretty steep learning curve, right?
Yeah,
pace.
Yeah. So I think that's probably the main one, and the one we've already talked about, which is kind of really map out and understand what your ecosystem is, and you should have a plan for managing it in a crisis. And we didn't have one. I've never put one in place before for any business that I've run, because these pandemics are new. But I think going forward, that would certainly be part of it. Disaster recovery and those kind of things weren't fit for purpose when you're dealing with a pandemic that closes a business, and many businesses were shut pretty much overnight.
It's a topic that I've been talking about with my clients around, and they're all networked organizations in complex environments. What have you genuinely learned, and what will you do differently? And there's a sort of the crisis plan, but sort of what knowledge and practices can you really stick to, because they will work best for you. And it's very easy now to sort of say, okay, without being flippant, depending on which country you're in the world, we're over it, or over the acute phase. Let's just go back, or let's move on to something else. There's a huge amount of learning, and it's great that you're at least humble enough to sort of.
And I think, look, probably the second thing, just reflecting on it, is I would have spent more time with the fans and the grassroots, the customers, the people that we're doing it for. I would have spent more time with those. It's hard to prioritize that when you're doing 18-hour days, trying to keep the business alive. But I think I would have prioritized more of that, actually.
Great. It's been a great conversation. I've learned a lot. I love rugby. I'm local to one of the clubs you mentioned, so I have a vested interest in that. It's been fascinating to learn, perhaps differently from some of the other conversations, at a more personal level, how it's felt to lead in an ecosystem going through a crisis. I take my hats off to you, hats off to Darren of leaving such a strong legacy in the sport. Credit to you. I hope everyone's enjoyed that conversation. There are plenty more coming up. In artificial intelligence, we're talking to the CEO of The Guardian as well. Sam's put it in the chat box. And if there's any follow up, do get in touch with me. And we'll be sharing the key points of this session as well as the recording. So look out for that in your inbox. Darren, thank you ever so much. Thank you to Rowena and Sam and the LBS team for making this happen. And thank you to all of you.